The sound of paper tearing echoed sharply through the quiet waiting area at Gate D18 of Seattle, Tacoma International Airport, like a clean slice through the dignity of the man standing in front of the lead flight attendant. Monica Raines, 42, once honored as a dedicated employee of Meridian Air, gripped the torn first-class ticket in her hand as if it had never held any value. Standing across from her, Julian Ward, a black man in his early 40s dressed in a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans and worn sneakers, did not flinch. His gaze was calm, his voice never raised, just a slow blink, as if silently weighing each possible outcome. What Monica didn't know, and never bothered to find out, was that the man she had just publicly humiliated in front of passengers, crew members, and dozens of silently recording phones was the very person who held 27% of Meridian Air's shares, and the power to change the fate of the entire airline. That day at 5:54 p.m. Pacific Time, Flight MA-122 from Seattle to San Francisco was in its pre-boarding phase. First, class passengers had begun to board, and the cabin still held its pristine, cold elegance like something out of a glossy advertisement. That was when Julian entered, quietly, discreetly, carrying nothing that would suggest authority or status. No assistant, no designer suit, no company badge or luxurious briefcase. Just a confirmed e-ticket, a valid state ID, and a singular purpose: to verify the truth buried beneath the scripted apologies of the Public Relations Department. In recent months, Julian had received no fewer than 14 complaints from passengers, most of them black or modestly dressed, reporting they had been denied service in first class, despite holding valid tickets. No one in the executive board had spoken up. So today, Julian chose to board the flight himself. But he hadn't expected the test to unfold so quickly or so harshly. The moment he scanned his ticket and approached seat 2A, Monica blocked his path, looked him over from head to toe, and said coldly, "You must be in the wrong cabin." Seconds later, Ethan Shaw, the attendant assigned to first class, approached from behind, smirking. "You look more like economy class to me." No one asked his name. No one looked at his ticket. No one queried who he was. And within 30 minutes, they would all wish they had paused, just once, to truly see the man they had dismissed so casually. Julian Ward was not the kind of man who preferred to manage from a distance. Throughout more than 2 decades of building Meridian Air, from a small regional carrier into a national brand, he had learned that reports and numbers only told part of the truth. The rest lived in the quiet murmurs of passengers, the hurried glances of crew members, and especially in the things no one dared to document. That was why when complaints laced with signs of discrimination began surfacing at an alarming rate, Julian didn't launch a flashy reform campaign or convene an emergency board meeting. Instead, he booked a flight under his real name, paid with his personal credit card, and chose to walk into the very system he had founded as a complete stranger. No assistant accompanied him, no honorary badge, no visible symbol of authority or status. Julian wore a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, and the same worn sneakers that had followed him through last year's business trips. No one at the airport recognized him, and that was exactly what he wanted. The most effective investigations always began with invisibility. He chose seat 2A, the front row of first class, with a clear view and wide access. It was the perfect vantage point to observe real behavior, real attitudes, and the true service culture of his in-flight crew. The only thing he brought with him, apart from a phone directly linked to his executive assistant Clara Hudson, was a faint hope that the previous allegations had been nothing more than isolated misunderstandings. But the moment he stepped into the cabin, that hope began to unravel. Monica, the lead flight attendant, didn't ask his name, didn't check his boarding pass. Her eyes landed instead on his unbranded T-shirt and the way he entered without nodding at the crew, like most business travelers would. She looked at him as though he were an item misplaced on the wrong shelf, and from that glance came the first rejection. "This area is not for you." Ethan, the flight attendant assigned to the cabin, approached from behind with a mocking smile. "You must have read the seat wrong." None of them noticed the thick black card in Julian's wallet, a founder's membership card. None remembered the face once featured on the cover of an aviation magazine 5 years ago, and none, in that moment, stopped to wonder why a man like him might be here. Julian wasn't angry. He simply opened his phone and sent Clara one brief message. Phase 1 begins. Not to seek punishment, but to find an answer to a question that had haunted him for many sleepless nights. When had the culture he once believed in disappeared? And could it still be reclaimed before it was too late? When Monica snatched the ticket from Julian's hand and tore it cleanly in half without the slightest hesitation, the entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath in a suffocating moment of stillness. It wasn't the loudness of the action, but the sheer audacity delivered so casually that stunned the room. Julian didn't react, not because he was surprised, but because of the terrifying familiarity of the situation. This wasn't the first time he had been judged by appearance alone. But this time, that judgment came on the very airline he had spent half his life building. Monica's words, "You don't belong in this first-class cabin," weren't just a rejection. They were an indictment of a system rotting from within. Ethan stood beside Monica, arms crossed as if enjoying a ridiculous performance. "Probably a fake ticket," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few passengers behind to glance over. No one said a word. A well-dressed white couple approached from the rear of the cabin. They said nothing, simply flashed their platinum membership cards and took their seats in 2A. Julian's seat, as if it had all been prearranged. Monica bowed her head and greeted them with a smile completely different from the one she had just offered Julian, who still stood by the row holding the torn ticket in his hand, his silence now a mirror reflecting everything around him. A young intern named Sophie Chen, only 23 years old and on her first flight as an assistant flight attendant, had silently witnessed everything. She had seen Julian's ticket scan green, a clear signal that the booking was valid. When she opened her mouth to clarify, Monica turned and cut her off coldly. "Not your place." Sophie stepped back, but instinct told her something was wrong. Without drawing attention, she hit the record button on her phone and tucked it into her uniform pocket. She didn't yet understand everything, but she knew one thing: truth doesn't get heard without evidence. A few rows ahead, a woman named Emily Roberts, 39, an executive from Portland, had begun recording on her personal phone. She whispered to the man beside her, "This is discrimination, and it's going to spread fast." When Julian presented his ID once more, Monica barely glanced at it before snapping, "We've seen this before. Dallas last year. Remember Ethan?" Both laughed dryly, as if using the fake ticket excuse to remove someone was a well-worn routine. But this time, they had chosen the wrong person, and they hadn't realized it yet. Inside the first-class cabin of flight MA227, the air thickened, as if someone had just dropped a heavy, invisible object onto the floor. Julian remained standing, gripping the torn fragments of his ticket, his gaze no longer one of resistance, but more like he was mentally recording a sequence of behavior, cold, systematic, and disturbingly deliberate. But what sent a chill down his spine wasn't the personal insult itself. It was what happened next when Monica pulled out her service iPad and began rapidly typing into the internal system. Within seconds, Julian Ward's name vanished from the reservation list. No warning, no apology, no verification. She simply erased the presence of a human being, as if he had never existed. "All set," Monica whispered to Ethan, tilting the screen toward him. "Now nobody can check anymore." Ethan let out a mocking laugh. "Unless he's the president." They both burst out laughing, unaware that Sophie, still at the back of the cabin, was clutching her phone in her uniform pocket, recording every word as if they were evidence for an upcoming trial. She was no longer just an intern. She had become a living witness to a small scheme that reflected a much larger system. In row 4, Emily and her companion, Daniel Moore, had started recording the entire incident from 2 different angles. Emily whispered quietly, "This won't end on this plane." Daniel nodded, his finger steady on the record button. "We're witnessing something much bigger than one denied passenger." The silence in the cabin was finally broken when Monica raised her voice and announced, "He is not on the passenger manifest. There is no Julian Ward booked in seat 2A. Julian didn't reply. He simply pulled out his phone and called Clara, who had been monitoring everything remotely. "Send the full booking file to the board, and attach the audio recording from last month's executive meeting. It's time to clean house," he said. Clara responded almost immediately. "Sent. I'm also watching the passenger videos go viral. The hashtag is spreading fast." As he ended the call, Monica and Ethan were still laughing. "There's no one named Julian Ward," she repeated, like a mantra meant to soothe her own nerves. What Monica didn't know was that every word had been recorded. Every attempt to erase a trace had left one behind. And Julian, the man they believed unworthy of seat 2A, was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. That abuse of power cannot be hidden when the eyes of an entire system are watching. As Monica returned with a triumphant smile and the declaration, "There is no passenger named Julian Ward," on the other side of the cabin, reality had already begun to quietly push back. In what seemed like absolute silence, the first sound came from a gentle tap. The clicking of a phone keyboard as Emily uploaded her first video to social media with the hashtag #MeridianShock. The caption was simple but piercing. He had a ticket. They just didn't like how he looked. Within 5 minutes, the views climbed from hundreds to thousands. Daniel wasn't far behind. His video, from a different angle, captured the moment Monica tore the ticket, her face calm, as if the act were routine. A man behind them muttered softly, "Looks like daylight robbery." No one laughed. On the plane, whispers spread like sparks through a dry forest. A middle-aged passenger leaned in toward his son and murmured, "They're gaming the whole system." The boy asked, "Who is he?" The father didn't answer, but his eyes were heavy with realization. Meanwhile, Sophie, the trainee flight attendant, kept her eyes fixed on her phone, where the first recording played back Monica's words. Carter's name doesn't belong in first class anyway. She knew she held evidence no one else could produce, undeniable and indelible. She had heard the laughter, witnessed the system being manipulated from within, and understood this was no longer a matter of error or misunderstanding. This was a choice, a silent agreement between Monica, Ethan, and the rest of the crew, except her. And now, as the videos continued to circulate, the comments began to pour in at an unstoppable pace. "He showed his ticket and they tore it up," one user wrote. "What if he's the CEO?" another asked. "And what if he's just a regular guy?" That question cut through every excuse like a blade. Julian had yet to rise, had yet to speak a single word to anyone. He simply sat there, silent as a shadow, but that shadow now carried weight. It slowed the rhythm of the entire cabin, made every crew member's step hesitant, turned every passenger's glance from curiosity to outrage. Monica began to feel it, to sense the air shifting. When another passenger stood up and said loudly, "I saw his code scan green," the quiet nods that followed rippled like an undercurrent. There were no chants, no slogans, just a silent transformation, the most powerful force that any oppressive system fears the most. Unity born from witnessing the truth. Without any command, the silence in the cabin gradually turned into a rising murmur, as if the passengers had collectively realized that this moment was no longer about a dispute between one traveler and the flight crew, but a larger dialogue between trust and manipulation. When Sophie stepped out from behind the small galley, her hand still gripping the phone with the recording ready to play, her eyes no longer showed worry, but resolve. She did not need to deliver a speech or give an explanation, just a single tap. And Monica's voice rang out clearly in the charged air. "Delete it. Julian's name shouldn't be in first class." This was followed by Ethan's mocking laugh. "Wearing that, he probably couldn't even make it past check-in." Each word landed like a slap in the face of the very system they were meant to serve, revealing not only prejudice, but a deliberate, organized complicity. Passengers nearby froze. Emily shifted her camera to capture Monica's face in the moment she was being exposed. Daniel, sitting beside her, whispered with tension tightening his voice. "No need to explain anything. This is the evidence." His video was uploaded instantly with a caption that struck at the core of the incident. "They tore his ticket. They deleted his name. Now they lie." In the cabin, a few passengers began to rise. No one shouted, no one caused a scene, but every glance carried defiance. A young man looked directly at Monica and said firmly, "I'm an attorney. If you delete one more data point, I will file a formal complaint the moment we land." Julian still had not moved, but the air around him had shifted. It was no longer cold or isolating. He was no longer alone. When an elderly woman stepped forward from the back of the cabin and softly said, "I lost my son to something like this. I won't let it happen again." First class ceased to be a space of submissive silence. It became a scene where justice was not only hoped for, but propelled by those who had once been forced into silence. Julian raised a hand to his ear and adjusted his earpiece. Clara's voice came through, sharp and clear. "We have enough evidence to convene an emergency board. Rachel, James, and Sophia are online. waiting for the signal. He replied calmly, "Just a few more minutes. Let them finish the game themselves." And just as he predicted, Monica was whispering to Ethan, "Do you think he's someone important?" Ethan glanced at Julian, then nodded warily. "I think I've seen that face somewhere before." But it was already too late to retreat. The wheel of truth was in motion, and this time the evidence was speaking for itself. In the cabin, now buzzing with tension from the recently released recordings, what Monica, Ethan, and even Captain Ross failed to anticipate was that the atmosphere had already begun to shift the moment they voiced their suspicion. Could he be someone? That question wasn't just a panicked reflex. It was the final warning before the control they had clung to slipped from their hands. Julian, the man still seated quietly in 2A, looked straight at Monica, and his gaze was no longer that of a humiliated passenger, but of someone now deciding the fate of an entire system. He put on his earpiece without saying a word, but those watching him were beginning to understand that something far bigger was unfolding. Sophie stood in the aisle, holding her phone, her expression no longer pale from fear, but calm enough to unsettle Monica. Many passengers had their phones out, not to capture more footage, but to stand guard over something greater. A principle, a boundary, and a human being who did not deserve to be treated like a misplaced object just because he didn't dress as they expected. When Julian finally rose for the first time since boarding, he didn't need to speak. His silence alone was a declaration. Across the cabin, a passenger spoke up. "If they lay another hand on him, I'll testify, and I won't be the only one." Murmurs of agreement rippled like falling dominoes. Captain Ross stepped out of the cockpit, sweat dotting his brow, his gaze fixed on Julian as he saw the man holding a sleek black metal card. Not a standard membership card, but a Meridian Air Executive Board credential, one held by only 3 people. Monica stepped back, her face paling as a realization dawned on her. You're Julian Ward?" she stammered. Ethan turned ghost white beside her, and Ross stood frozen, his expression collapsing as if watching his sense of authority dissolve before his eyes. Julian nodded slightly, no words needed, for in his ear, Clara's voice came through. "The board is watching live. If they push one step further, you have full authority to act." No threats were necessary. Just a few glances, a few lines from earlier played back in the oppressive quiet, and the power dynamic reversed. The man they tried to erase was now the one who could decide who would be allowed to stay. And when Julian finally spoke, every word landed like a verdict. "You tore up my ticket. You erased my name from the system. You humiliated me publicly. Now show me how you plan to justify that to the entire executive board of this very airline." Julian's final words struck like a switch being flipped, freezing the entire first-class cabin into silence. No one dared to speak. Monica stood motionless, arms hanging by her sides, lips trembling as if trying to offer an excuse, but unable to form a single sound. Ethan could no longer maintain his usual smugness, his eyes darting nervously, as if searching for an escape route. Captain Ross swallowed hard, his gaze falling as the soft crackle of the intercom signaled that the airline's executive board was now listening in on every word. But what truly shifted the atmosphere came not from the crew, but from the passengers. Emily stepped forward from the back rows, holding up her phone, playing Monica's cruel chuckle, followed by the words, Carter's name doesn't belong in first class anyway. Her voice rang out, clear and measured. I believe we've just heard a deliberate act of discrimination, and if anyone has doubts, I can play it again. Immediately, a wave of subdued but firm applause rippled through the cabin, not loud but resolute, as if marking the quiet end of the crew's authority. Julian didn't need to rally anyone. He simply turned to Sophie and gave a slight nod. She understood. And for the first time since boarding the flight, she raised her voice with calm conviction. He had a valid ticket. I saw the system confirm it. I also clearly heard Monica and Ethan discussing how to delete his name from the system. Ross whipped around, his voice shaky. You're an intern. You're not authorized to. But his protest was cut off by another passenger, a man in his 70s who had remained silent until now, rising from his seat and stating firmly, "Don't blame her. This is on you." At that moment, Julian calmly pulled out his phone and activated the speaker. A deep male voice resonated with authority. "This is Thomas Lane, board member of Meridian Air. All audio, video, and system logs have been verified. Anyone found deliberately tampering with passenger records will be subject to disciplinary action, including immediate termination." Monica nearly collapsed. Ethan's breathing turned erratic. Captain Ross lowered his head, unable to utter a word. Julian remained silent throughout the announcement, as if this was the moment he had envisioned for years, and now he no longer needed to shout to reclaim his place, because the system itself was finally speaking for him. The airplane cabin no longer felt like part of a routine commercial flight. It had transformed into a public courtroom, where everything once hidden behind the curtain was now laid bare under the harsh light of justice. After the voice of Thomas Lane, representing the board of directors, rang out with authority, the final mask of calm fell from Monica's face. She could no longer pretend. Any words of justification were now meaningless. Her lips trembled, but Julian had already turned away, no longer paying attention. For him, the verdict had been delivered, not through words, but through irreversible consequences. Ethan, who had so eagerly played along with Monica, now leaned against the cabin wall, his face pale as paper. The smirks were gone. The sidelong glances had disappeared. Every ounce of arrogance he once held had turned into a weight too heavy for him to carry. Captain Ross, once the unquestioned authority of the cabin, stood silently. No more commands left his lips. Instead, he gave a slow nod as Thomas Lane added through the speaker, "The entire crew involved will be suspended immediately and escorted off the aircraft before departure. Legal proceedings are being finalized." Julian reached into his coat and pulled out his executive credential, not to raise it high or to make a statement, but to mark the close of this moment with quiet finality. His gaze moved from Monica to Ross to Ethan, carrying both the coldness of a man who had been dismissed and the calm resolve of one now holding full authority. He turned to Sophie and said softly, "You're staying." Then he addressed the newly arrived supervisor stepping into the cabin. "These three will be removed from the flight. And she," nodding towards Sophie, "will be reinstated as training supervisor." Sophie's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. But Julian didn't smile, only looked at her with the quiet confidence of someone who had just placed his trust in the right person. Applause began to rise in the cabin, not out of rage or sudden emotion, but because the passengers had just witnessed something rare. Justice had not been dragged through the dirt. It had stood tall, steady, and dignified. An elderly passenger leaned toward the person beside him and murmured, "I thought he would explode. But he chose the right path. He made the system confront its own failure." Julian no longer needed to speak. He had reclaimed not just his first-class seat, but something far more vital, the trust without which no airline can survive. As the airplane door closed behind the 3 former crew members, no longer in uniform, stripped of their authority and their condescending stares, the air in the cabin felt cleansed. The whispers of prejudice were gone, as were the doubtful glances, leaving only a profound and solemn silence. Julian returned to seat 2A, the very place from which he had been arrogantly denied, now welcoming him back with quiet respect. He did not need the title of CEO, nor the banner of authority. He simply sat down as a regular passenger. Yet in that moment, everyone knew he had just rewritten the meaning of true worth behind an airline ticket. Sophie, now officially wearing a temporary name badge with her new title, stepped back into the cabin with a mix of proud poise and disbelief. Her new colleagues from the replacement crew greeted her with silent nods, an unspoken acknowledgement. She no longer needed to say anything, because her voice, whether through a recording or through the courage to stand for what was right, had already echoed throughout the system. A young passenger passing by paused briefly and whispered, "You didn't stay silent, and that saved this flight." Sophie smiled, for the first time all day, without fear. Inside the operations headquarters of Meridian Air, an emergency board of directors meeting had been called in the middle of the night. Rachel, Julian's executive assistant, stepped in on his behalf to announce immediate decisions. All passenger handling policies would be reviewed. Every staff member would be required to undergo anti-bias training within the next 60 days, and a direct reporting channel to the board would be opened for all front-line employees. Julian never sought applause. He only needed a system he could believe in, not because he was the CEO, but because he had once been the one denied, simply for not fitting the mold of first class. Real change does not come from plaques on walls, but from how people treat each other when they believe no one is watching. And that night, on Flight 227, a passenger named Julian Carter quietly initiated a reform without a single press conference. He did not walk away feeling triumphant, but with a quiet smile. Because he understood that sometimes what transforms an entire airline is not a policy, but the moment when one ordinary man dares to sit still in exactly the place he belongs. Julian Carter's story was never just a confrontation between a passenger and a flight attendant, or a clash between authority and bias. It was a sobering reminder that what we wear should never determine how we are treated. In a world where prejudice can disguise itself as policy, Julian's quiet yet resolute action set a precedent, one where integrity does not need to shout in order to be heard. He did not retaliate. He did not expose anyone with anger. He chose to lead with composure, with evidence, and above all, with human dignity, even for those who once denied him. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of what they wear or what their name is, then hit like and subscribe to help spread stories that awaken our collective conscience. And don't forget to comment with 3 words: deserves to be respected, as a reminder that titles do not define worth. It is how we treat others that truly does.